certainly have fears that there is a serial killer at loose in Perth.
Sarah Spears, Jane Rimmer, Kira Glennon.
And every time you saw a young girl walking by, you think, oh God, is she going to be the next victim?
Now, one man stands accused.
If police are right and Edwards is the Claremont serial killer, he's been hiding in plain sight for 20 years.
Bradley Edwards is a self-confessed rapist. In 1995, the accused murderer grabbed a teenage girl as she walked home, tied her up, gagged her and raped her in a cemetery. Today, the court heard explicit and graphic details of her harrowing account. Thanks for joining us for Claremont in Conversation. I'm Natalie Bonjolo. Also in the studio, we have a criminal defence lawyer, Damien Cripps.
Thanks for having me along.
And calling in from Supreme Court, the West Australian newspaper's Tim Clarke. Hi, Tim.
Hi, guys.
I think maybe before we start, we should probably just let listeners know that we will be discussing some of these graphic details in this podcast. Tim, you've sat through this evidence today. Can you just tell us what was day 11 like for you being in the courtroom?
Yeah, it was another heavy day, to be honest, Nat. As I've mentioned before, we haven't been getting sort of really advanced notice of what the next witness is. So we all turned up this morning, I think, sort of maybe expecting a bit more personal evidence around Jane, given that that's what we were doing late last week. But prosecutor Carmel Barbagallo stood up and said that she was going to read into the record multiple statements from this person who we know is the victim of the Karrakatta rape, and that's what happened. And it took Ms. Barbagallo probably close to an hour to read all the four statements in, and as you would expect, they were graphic, they were disturbing, and they affected probably everyone that heard them, I would suggest.
And so these were statements. Was the victim present in court?
She was at the start of the reading in. She listened to the first one, which was the very first statement she gave basically on the day or on the day after the attack happened.
And at that stage she would have been 17 at that stage,
correct.
Right?
Yes, she was a teenager. So she was in court with a lot of her supporters with her. And then after that first one was finished, she basically quietly got up and left court. And then the reading-ins continued, as I say, for about an hour. And then there was just a couple of little more statements sort of after that, and then the morning break, and then she was back in court, as she has been, for a lot of the trial so far. So, yes, she was there, and obviously was Mr. Edwards.
So this obviously isn't the first time then she has faced him if she's been in court.
No, absolutely
today.
not. I mean,
Right.
she's been a sort of quite a regular attendee of most of the court hearings way back, dating back probably one of the second or third hearings after Mr. Edwards' arrest. She was in court, and she's been, as I say, quite a regular attendee, along with the police and others that have been supporting her. And as we said, she was there on the day that Mr. Edwards pleaded to these crimes, just before the trial was due to start, and she's been here for a lot of the trial too.
So can you maybe just talk us through her account of what happened in her statements?
Yeah, so this was a night in February 1995, so just about 10 or 11 months before Sarah went missing. Sarah Spears went missing. She had been out for a night with friends into Northbridge, which is the entertainment district of Perth for those who don't live here, and then on to Club Bayview, which we've heard a lot about, which is one of the main nightclubs in the Claremont area. It was a normal sort of freewheeling teenagers' night out, drinks and dancing and laughter, and then she found at the end of the night she was a bit short on cash. She only had 50 cents in her pocket, so rather than try and make her way back to where she was living in Cottesloe, which is sort of not too far away, but far away enough that it would have been pretty decent walk, she decided to make her way up to a friend's place up at Goodrey Street, which is literally 15-minute walk from Club Bayview, probably less if you've got a good pace on. So that's what she decided to do. This was about 2:30 in the morning.
Yeah.
And
Had she been drinking?
Yeah, she had, but not to excess. She was obviously enjoying her night out, but didn't enjoy it too much. And then obviously she made her way down to a friend's house, and she was about halfway down to that walk when she just told the police she was grabbed from behind in the dark on a footpath in a place called Roe Park, which is just a little park, just a little way out of the Claremont area.
And had she heard anything prior to being grabbed? Did she say in her testimony or in her statements?
Nothing. This is quite one of the most sort of chilling aspects of it. She was completely oblivious to any peril or danger awaiting her until she felt the force of these two hands on her upper arms from behind, and then within seconds she was taken to the floor, pinned, and then basically incapacitated by having her wrists and hands tied behind her back with what we now know was a knotted sort of plastic cord that Mr. Edwards had brought with him, and then she was also gagged, had a hood put over her mouth, then had her feet tied in a similar way. And then Mr. Edwards basically picked her up. She described it, picked her up like a baby. So sort of one arm and beneath her knees, another arm beneath her back, basically carried her completely incapacitated to his vehicle, which was just 10 paces or so away.
And had she screamed out at any point at this stage, or?
Yeah, well, that's what was interesting. She said in her statement she froze basically when this attack started. And then she described it as, say, having this cloth or piece of material shoved quite hard into her and deep into her mouth, and then had the bag put over her head. So at that point, she was, frozen in fear, and also basically unable to make any sound that might have been audible any distance away because of the way that she'd been incapacitated.
And so, after what has happened after that, he's put her into
he's put her in a car. He's put her in a car. She described it as feeling like a panel van because she didn't feel constricted inside the car, even though she couldn't see. And then he's driven around for about half an hour. She said, and she said that she was getting a little bit knocked around in the back of the vehicle because she could feel them turning corners.
Right.
And then the car slowed and then it stopped. She described thinking about 25 minutes, half an hour. But it turned out that the actual destination was literally would have been a 2-minute drive away in a cemetery just around the corner. It's called Karrakatta Cemetery. It's basically the main cemetery for the Perth metropolitan area. So you can imagine how big it would be.
It's very big. It's very old. I think it's about 120 years old, and it's very leafy and green and bushy, isn't it? And it's probably only 2K from Claremont, I think.
Yeah, and being so big and so expansive, and also obviously shady trees and whatever. There was a particular part of the cemetery that Mr. Edwards drove up to, which was basically in a far corner of the actual cemetery, which was particularly isolated, where he obviously felt that he could do what he wanted to do without being disturbed.
And so, obviously, the car stops, and what happens next? Yeah,
so he then carries her out of the car in a similar fashion, and then basically sort of drops her or places her on the ground and begins to drag her a short way into as I say, the sort of area of the cemetery, and then basically begins his sexual assault on her, which was what we describe as degrading. It was persistent. It was quite, as far as these things go, quite long lasting. It was minutes rather than seconds. And in the course of that, he untied her legs and then at some point also took the hood off. But she described in one of her statements as she was still sort of, frozen in fear, couldn't believe it was happening to her. Basically then tried to, she said she was too scared to open her eyes, let alone try and make a noise.
Right.
And then at some point also basically started to play dead, or at least pretend to be unconscious, in the hope that it would just end.
And did he leave at that point? How long was she laying there, pretending to play dead or to be unconscious?
So after about 10 minutes, he got up and walked away, and then not a few paces, and then came back, picked the lady up, and then sort of basically dumped her in a nearby bush, walked away again, and at this point she thought, well, it must be over by now, started to get up. And then he came back a third time, picked her up and placed her in a nearby sort of more dense bush, basically just threw her in there. Her hands are still tied at this point. She's, her clothes have been ripped off her. And obviously, you can imagine the pain and also emotional and physical distress. And at that point, he has left. And so she's waited a decent amount of time and then basically got up and tried to make her escape, which he has. There was a nearby gate, which she's gone through, got onto it's quite a busy road next to the cemetery. And at that point, she's then tried to make her way towards basically civilization houses, or as it turned out, a medical complex where she was able to get some help.
Yeah, you cannot actually comprehend the terror that she would have been feeling at that time, and not knowing whether this person was coming back for her, I think must have just been excruciating. Yeah,
you can imagine, a 17-year-old girl had enjoyed a night out with friends, as hundreds of thousands of teenagers do every weekend all over the world, and but this one turned into a complete nightmare, which I'm sure as her and her family have lived with
for a very long time. And I guess she went for a very long time thinking she would never get justice over this attack.
Yeah, so that's the next stage, I suppose, is after she'd been tended to at the hospital. Obviously, police became involved, and very, very involved very quickly. We heard from a detective today that actually was with her on the morning after. So this has happened sort of in going into dawn, and so by sort of 7 o'clock in the morning, police are alerted. Her family's been alerted.
Who did she first get contact with, Tim? So how did she first raise the alarm?
She got to a nearby hospice, tried to get some help there. Didn't get much joy. Went to Hollywood Hospital, which we've already heard a lot about. Managed to alert a nurse there who had let her in. She obviously quickly discovered that this was serious. Taken into the hospital and was cared for there, basically given some clothes to wear or some hospital garments to wear. And then, as I say, the police arrived, very quickly ascertained it was a very serious offence. Forensic officers were called, and then this particular detective actually took the lady in their car to basically drive around the Claremont area to try and get bearings of where it had occurred, and where she'd walked, and then also took her to the park where she'd been abducted from. And in the meantime, forensic officers have swooped in and very quickly found the scene, and also found the clothing, the items of clothing, lower half of her body, which she was wearing, which had been removed during the attack, and they found those, and also obviously the cord which her hands were tied with, so that was still on her.
What was the cord exactly?
Well, it was described as sort of plastic coated cord. So one might think of a clothesline possibly, but the way that the police officer described it at the time, which was interesting, was telecom or Telstra or telecommunication cord, which might be used in that in that industry, and we obviously all know the possible relevance and importance of that now.
And at what point were her family contacted?
Yeah, so it was actually her dad that she managed to get hold of via an old school reverse charge call from a telephone box.
Yeah.
So probably no one under 25 knows what that means listening, but she dialed the number for reverse charges, managed to get through to her dad, and basically made him acutely aware of what had happened to her, and he rushed over to the Hollywood hospital and basically arrived almost at the same time as the police did.
Yeah, just that phone call that just would be unimaginable as a parent.
Indeed. The one you'd never want to get.
And so did her father have a statement in court today, or was he...
Yes, he did briefly, just basically describing the call that came through,
right.
And that she was, when she did get through, she was upset, hysterical, distressed, and he basically described her as telling him that she'd been tied up by a man and taken to a cemetery, and he hadn't heard the actual graphic details of what had happened until he basically got to the hospital, but he was obviously well aware of something very serious happening.
Yeah. And it seems, I mean, I guess police have to do their job, but just when you were telling us that then, it just seemed extraordinary that this girl has gone through this horrific experience, but pretty much straight away they had her bundled in the car driving around Claremont, going from place to place and location to location, trying to pinpoint, I guess, where she'd been snatched from and where she'd been left and things like that.
Yeah, not sure that would happen now. Not sure that's particularly seen as gold standard sort of police practice, but I guess back in the day, strike while the iron's hot, and so they really wanted to get a good idea, and in some respects I suppose that was the right thing to do, because they were able to seize the clothes almost immediately, which are obviously vital in the case, the prosecution for the rape, but as we've touched on, and probably will again later on in this podcast, particularly the shorts that were left behind by Mr. Edwards after the attack, they're of absolute sort of vital evidence, not only in this case but also going forward to linking this case with the Claremont murders.
So, Tim, just in relation to this person's evidence altogether, it might seem obvious to a lot of people, but some people will be wondering why this evidence is relevant, or how it would come into a trial. Was there any discussion about that these statements being read in? Did the court address that?
Yeah, well, they have done, Damien, in previous pre-trial hearings. So this was, just to put this in context, Mr. Edwards was originally charged with this crime, the Huntingdale crime, and two of the murders way back in December 2016. And basically right up until about 3 weeks before the trial, he had maintained his innocence on all of those. And then out of the blue, he, 2 or 3 weeks before the trial, he pleaded guilty to Huntingdale, which we heard about last week, and he pleaded guilty to the rape. So the prosecution obviously no longer has to prove that he's done those. We know he's done those because he said he did. But in all the pre-trial sort of prevarication, the prosecutor argued for the propensity evidence, which we discussed last week. Yep. Basically, if he is able to do this to a young girl in Claremont, 17, take her off the street, abduct her, have his way with her, that surely, as according to the prosecution, could be a precursor to other crimes, i.e. 3 young women going missing off the street from Claremont, and all this happened within, just over a 2-year period. So, and the judge had ruled that admissible pre-trial. He'd said, yes, I agree, that could be prevalent for me. Then Mr. Edwards obviously pleads guilty, but the prosecution say, well, it's still, it's even more relevant now, because we know it's Mr. Edwards that has done this, and so we say that this evidence is even more prevalent, hence why it's able to come in today.
I mean, essentially, Damien, I guess, is this the prosecution arguing that, the accused has graduated from being a rapist to a killer?
Well, Nat, obviously I'm in a position where I don't know the actual answer to that.
No.
But what I could say to potentially assist in what people might be thinking about that is that the judges had considered what's been put before him and made a decision about it, and it leads back to what we might have discussed the other day, and it never sits well with people. But essentially what I raised to Tim and you, Nat, is that in this incident here, and I'm certainly not discounting what happened to this person, but she was let go. And that's something that's something I wanted to ask Tim about.
Like the Telstra living witnesses were let go.
Did it resonate in the court the way that this evidence was presented, that it was a different incident to the ones that are accused, in that this person was let go?
Yeah, well, today, no, actually, I've got to say, because we hadn't heard the full details. I mean, we knew what the basics of what had happened, but and to hear it sort of as it was relayed sort of three times it got more and more detailed, if you like, because as the police were taking these statements over a course of a number of months after, the details became more detailed. Mr. Jovic has pointed towards that, that possibility, or that anomaly, I suppose you could say, in previous hearings, but he didn't really go anywhere with the particular evidence of the victim today. It was just read in, and obviously you can't cross-examine someone who's evidence being read in. But what Mr. Jovic did do later on, and we'll get to later on, was he began his assault on a legal assault, on the continuity of the evidence, particularly forensic evidence that was collected by the police on this day. And we know that is going to be a running theme throughout all of this, because the forensic links are the other major link between this attack and the murders, because the prosecutors are going to say there's a DNA link between the Karrakatta victim and Kira, and they're going to say there are fibre links between the Karrakatta victim and both Jane and Kira. And so if Mr. Jovic wants to knock down or try and weaken the chain, if you like, the prosecution establishes that these must have been or were done by the one man, that's what he's going to have to work on, and that's what he started to work on this afternoon.
So, Tim, you had said earlier that the police officer who was the forensic expert, and I think, was she a specialist in photography? Yes,
so she was basically the crime scene photographer on the night, yes, or in the morning, yes.
So she has come along very quickly, presumably, and has taken all these various photographs, you've said, of her shorts and all these sorts of things. And did Paul Jovic raise any issues with any of those photographs or any of the exhibits?
Yeah, so absolutely he did. This was, so these shorts were found at the scene. Forensics were called, as they would be, obviously, and some of the records showed that the exhibits, as they now are, were photographed what they call in situ, which is basically where they were found, to show where they are, and then they were obviously photographed again when they were got back to whichever police station it was. There was also photos of the crime scene taken, which quite clearly showed drag marks between some of the gravestones, where the victim had said that he dropped me and then dragged me basically backwards under my arms, so my feet were dragging on the ground and my shoes popped off. And so there we go. That's the record of the crime scene. And we were shown those photos in court of the crime scene taken, and we were shown the photos of the clothing that was taken, and we were shown photos of the knotted cord that were also taken.
Was it very clear? Were these photos quite clear to see?
Well, the ones taken at the police station were. The ones of the clothes in situ weren't, because we couldn't see them, and the police can't find them. So that's the major issue with those, is that there's no actual record of those photographs existing anymore. The ones of the exhibits as they were found at the cemetery at the time, and that is where Mr. Jovic pointed much of his questioning to the officer this afternoon, basically trying to get her to explain, well, I know you say you would have done this, and you say you did do this, but there's no record of where are the photographs.
So she remained adamant, though, that she had taken these photographs in situ.
She did, but where they are now, well, we just don't know.
Who knows?
So, Tim, just we were talking before about the witness that gave evidence the other day and utilised the opportunity to actually give the evidence themselves.
Yeah.
This was a bit different today. Was it feeling different in the court?
Yeah, I think it. I think it. Well, when Damien, you'd have done these trials. It's never easy listening at that type of evidence, whether it's read in via statement or whether the person who's experienced it is telling the court in person. It's difficult.
So Tim,
it's harrowing.
Can I just ask this? In relation to the evidence that was read in today, was it your feeling that it was more effective because it was delivered without emotion?
Oh, yeah, that's a really good question, actually. I mean, I've always been told by lawyers and people who work in the judicial system that first person is always best in terms of, you want to hear it from the person. But there's just circumstances where that's not, that it just doesn't need to and can be more distressing. And obviously I would suggest that this is probably one of those things. The way Miss Barbagallo presented it was very matter of fact, but I've got to say the details were, shocking enough that even being read by a neutral person quite quickly into court, it still had a big emotional impact, and at least one person who wasn't the victim, who was in the public gallery, did actually leave the court quite upset at hearing what had happened. So, it was a different feeling, but no less emotional, I would say.
Did they come back, Tim?
They did. Yeah, they did after a short while. Yeah.
And what about Edward's reaction in court today?
Very stoic as usual.
Yes.
He was taking quite a lot of notes as the witness statements, the statements were being read out. He didn't look towards the back of the court much. He basically kept his eyes forward, sort of focused on Miss Barbagallo as she was reading it all out. Sort of business as usual for him, really. But he did seem to be paying sort of very close attention to the statements as they were being relayed.
But he's not looking around to the back. I always find it interesting as to where he would be looking.
No, he wasn't.
There was a reference today, I understand, about one of the security guards who was doing patrols around the Hollywood Village Hospice that night. Yeah,
there were actually two security guards that gave evidence today. One who was employed by Hollywood Hospital to do his rounds there, and one that was employed by Karrakatta Cemetery to do rounds there. And you might think that the Karrakatta Cemetery security guard would have been more important, but as it turned out, it was the Hollywood Hospital guy and his penchant for smoko or 10 during a shift that actually proved to be important, because he was at a certain entrance at the hospital having a smoke at about the right time, about 5:20 that morning, when he saw full beam headlights coming towards him at Monash Avenue, which was straight into his eye line. He couldn't see the people in the van because of the bright lights, but when it turned left, he saw the Telstra logo on the side of it, and he was quite sure that it was a Telstra or Telecom logo on that brand new, as he described it, white sort of panel van, high ace van new model as it would have been in 1995, which was just another little bit of circumstantial evidence, which tends to point to sort of white Telstra vehicles being around the Claremont area at particular nights of interest.
Tim, you just said then that the security guard had given evidence that he couldn't see the people in the van. Could you just clarify, if you can, you might not be able to, did that person indicate that it was people, or couldn't actually say whether it was a person or people?
No, he couldn't see any occupants, actually, Damien, because, as you say, he said he almost, the lights were so bright in his face as it came up the hill that he actually had to turn away until it turned left. And that's the only sort of distinguishing feature was the he noticed the shiny paint and he noticed the logo. So it would have been interesting if he had been able to see inside what he would have been able to see.
Again, this link to Telstra, even right now, while we're talking about this, we've had a listener email us in and say, their frustration that during the course of this, that police didn't talk publicly about these several reports of Telstra cars picking up people and these attacks and what have you. So, it's still a source of frustration for everyone.
It would be a difficult decision for the police to have made back then about what they were going to reveal. And it's easy with hindsight to look back and say how much of a benefit it might have been or it might not have been, but it would have been a very difficult decision to make back then, I would have thought, Nat.
Yeah, I absolutely concur with that. I mean, and a bit like, there's certain details that the police want the public to know because that's what they think will bring in the most information, and there's definitely certainly certain details that they don't want anyone to know outside of that room because to release them would be to give over a huge investigative advantage that they have. So I mean, I'm sure we'll hear much more about this in the weeks and months to come because I would assume it'll be basically something that will have to be addressed during the course of evidence about how much did they know about Telstra, potential Telstra and Telcom involvement. But
Nat and Tim, it is good that people can email in and say those things at this position, and that's what this kind of forum is all about. It's conversation, and the whole state have a view about what's happened. It's a great opportunity for people to actually email in and voice their views.
Yeah, and it's good that people take an interest in the legal system and how it works. We do have a question for you, actually, Damien. John Chappell, who's been listening in from Texas, he is curious as to, in the unlikely event that the judge could not preside to the end of the trial, is there a backstop for that?
There's no easy answer, I would say, John, and thanks for the question. In a situation like this, I would suggest that the avenue, if that happened, would be one that the courts would deal with as it happened. It would, especially if it got right towards the end of the trial and something caused the judge to not be available to finish it. It's likely that it would be a mistrial and need to start again. So, but that being said, I can't see inside the court system completely, and I'm not sure. But if you could think about that, the position would be that one person had sat there for that whole time and considered all those things and developed ideas about what the argument had been along the way. It would be very difficult for them, a person to come in, any person, come in.
You just can't just call in a sub, can you?
No, I think it would cause, it would be a terrible position to be in, but it's a great question because these are some of the issues. It does happen, and Tim will tell you there's many a trial that along the way have been tipped over, if I could put it that way, by virtue of unforeseen things happening.
Unforeseen circumstances, yes, but that would be just a dreadful position. But it's a fair question because we are all only human, even Judge Stephen Hall.
Well, fingers crossed we don't have to contend with that in this trial. Thanks for your time today, Tim. I know it was probably very difficult for everyone in court today, and also very difficult to sort of go over all these details again. So thank you for your time. Thanks,
Pleasure.
Damien, for coming in.
No problems, Nat. Thanks for having me on board, as usual.
And thanks everyone for listening. We'll be back tomorrow with Day 12, and you can contact us on Claremont Podcast at wanews.com.au. We appreciate all your feedback, so keep those coming through. And just before you go, if you or someone you know has been affected by the details in this podcast, you can contact Lifeline on 13 11 14 or the Sexual Assault Resource Centre, which is 1800 199 888. Okay, thank you for listening. We'll be back tomorrow night with Claremont in Conversation.
This podcast was hosted by Natalie Bongiorlo, produced by Kate Ryan and Alicia Preedy, and recorded in the studios of 7 West Media. Audio files were provided from the archives of the 7 Network and the West Australian. Sign up for daily emails and all the latest on the Claremont trial at thewest.com.au.